Right, hello everyone. We are in for the first video of 2025. And as I had mentioned at the end of our last year, which was only a week ago, we are going to do two Russian topic videos moving into the month of January. One we will do next week. To this week, we're going to cover the earlier one. And the topic for this week's video, we're going to look in particular at a very specific war in history where Russia ends up becoming a major power on the European stage and somewhat on the world stage as a result of, at the expense of another European major power player at the time. So, for those of you who have heard of this war, this is not a war that I feel a lot of people outside the countries that participated are probably aware of. And that would be for this week's topic, we're going to go and take a look at the Great Northern War, which occurred between 1700 and 1721. This was a 21-year long war. In the process, the European Kingdom of Sweden, the Swedish Empire, ends up basically getting beaten and is no longer a major power player by the end of this war. And in its place, and in that void that it has created, Russia fills the vacuum rather quickly. So this is the war that makes Imperial Russia. This is the war that brings Russia into a major player in European affairs. And that is what we're going to take a look at today. Now, for the sake of content of this video, and this is mind you, this is a 21-year long war. You could go many different ways you want to cover it. There are some videos out there that go way in depth for that. For the purpose of this video that we're going to do, we're going to primarily look at this war through the perspective of the Russians, through the Russian experience that was through this war. I know that there were other nations involved, of course. You had the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, you had Prussia, you had Denmark, you had Sweden. I mean, Sweden will get involved nonetheless because that's who we're fighting. And even Great Britain ends up getting involved at one point. There are many different countries, but for the sake of this video and for the content that we're looking at for the goal, we're going to primarily look at it from the Russian experience. So to start with the Great Northern War, you have to go all the way back to the year of 1700. And in the year of 1700, Russia is not the Russia of today. It is almost on the very fringes of Eastern Europe. Some rulers in Europe don't even consider it to be part of the European continent. And Russia is ruled at this time by a very young czar. And mind you, it's not even the Russian Empire at this point. It's called the Tsardom of Russia. And Russia is ruled by a very young czar, as we said. His name is Peter the First, who would later be called Peter the Great and is still known as that today. Now, Peter was an ambitious young czar. He wanted to expand Russia and westernize it as much as conveniently possible. He saw the success that the Western nations in Europe were having, most notably England, France, and Spain, and even uh, the Holy Roman Empire and Sweden. He wanted to westernize Russia to get it closer to the other European countries in terms of culture, in terms of methods, in terms of governance. This is what he wanted. Unfortunately for Peter, there's going to be a roadblock toward his goals of expanding Russian power, especially because he wants power gained in one particular area. He wants to expand west. He wants Russian sea access to the Baltic Sea. Fortunately for him, there's another power on the European stage that's much more powerful than Russia at this point that has control over the Baltic coastlines, and that is the Swedish Empire. At this time, Sweden is one of the most powerful nations in Europe, and it has been for the last 100 to 150 years. So they're kind of standing in Peter's way of getting in there. And Sweden at this time is not something to be trifled with. It has had over 150 years of dominance in its region of Europe, and that's not looking like it's going to end anytime soon. Russia had previously had some coastline on the Baltic region. They actually had some coastline back in the 1500s during the 16th century, but in 1584, Sweden had actually seized control over the Russian Baltic provinces, including the historic city of Novgorod, which eventually in 1616 Sweden gave back Novgorod to Russia, to the Tsardom of Russia, but they kept control over all of the other Baltic regions. The Swedish also control Finland at this time, which is not in Russian hands at that point. So Sweden is kind of the roadblock toward Russian expansion, and Peter knows very well that if he truly wants to expand to the Baltic Sea, he's going to have to go through Sweden to get there. Now, you might ask, why is Peter so, ambitious to expand to the Baltic Sea? What is so critical about the Baltic Sea? Well, mind you, he wants to westernize Russia. And what better way to do that than to partake in trade with westernized European countries such as England and the Netherlands, which are two of the biggest trading empires at that time. But in order to open up those trade routes, he needs access to the Baltic coastlines. And Peter is correctly also recognizing that Russia's lack of sea access is also causing it to becoming very hurt economically, and he needs that sea access in order to better Russia's economy. So at this time, Sweden has also got a new ruler. Sweden ends up getting a new ruler named Charles XII. And Charles XII is very young, actually a little younger than Peter was. And he is very much going to be a catalyst for everything that follows because Sweden has all of these other powers surrounding it. It has the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. It has the Tsardom of Russia. It has the Kingdom of Denmark. It has Prussia. It has all of these other kingdoms and principalities around it who are kind of just jostling at the bit to get back at Sweden and attack it and weaken its power militarily while gaining it for themselves. They want Sweden basically knocked down a peg or two. And when the 12th comes to the throne in the late 1690s, it presents an opportunity to these rivals that Sweden has that are surrounded to these rival neighbors because they see weakness. This is a very young and unexperienced ruler. This is the country. Sweden is not as powerful militarily as it had been years before. It's still very quite powerful, obviously, but not as it had once been. And they kind of see this as the opportunity to go after Sweden and get what they're wanting. So here, just before we go much further, we have two images of the primary two monarchs involved. So this is King Charles XII of Sweden. This is the guy that comes to the throne in the late 1690s of Sweden, and he's going to be the catalyst for a lot of the events that are going to occur in this great Northern War that will erupt. And by the end of it, he'll actually be dead. And then here we have a portrait of the Russian Tsar Peter the First, or Peter the Great, who is going to become the founder of Imperial Russia. So that brings us to Johann Patkul. And Johann Patkul was a Livonian noble and patriot. He was from the region of Livonia. And in case you don't know where Livonia is, it is in modern day Estonia. And in case that does not help you, we will use map. Many people don't take geography class, trust me. I've seen it. I know people who can't even name all 50 states and yet live in the United States of America. So this is a map of the Baltic region, the Baltic area in about 1700. So the green down here, this is the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. They're kind of an ally of Russia. They're also another rival to Sweden. The pink over here is the Tsardom of Russia. This is their territory. As you can see, Russia does not have access to the Baltic Sea. This here is the Baltic Sea. Russia does not have access here because all of this is controlled by Sweden. All this Baltic provinces here and Finland itself is also controlled by Sweden at this time. And Livonia, modern day Estonia, is about right here. And down here would be Latvia, and Lithuania would be a little further down here. But Livonia is this region right here. This is Swedish Livonia. And Johann Pakul comes from Livonia. Now, years ago, Livonia had actually been conquered by Sweden, and as part of the agreement they came to with the native Livonian nobility, they came to the agreement that the Livonian nobility would be more than happy to be allowed to retain their property rights, to retain some form of local governance in Livonia, that they weren't going to have their authority diminished massively, and the Livonian nobles had agreed to this. Unfortunately, during the reign of King Charles XI, King Charles XI had started to renege on those promises and actually started to become more of an absolute monarch. And this continued under his successor, the young Charles XII. Johann Pakul, being a Livonian noble, is not taking too kindly to his authority and prestige being kind of slowly sapped away from him and the others like him. And so he ends up petitioning the Swedish capital of Stockholm against this reduction of the noble's power. However, in the process of doing so, he ends up getting himself branded as a traitor to the crown and marked for execution. Pakul would end up escaping execution and instead began to travel Europe, trying to seek the foundation and formation of an anti Swedish coalition in order to go to war against Sweden in order to help out his native Livonia. He really pursued two major allies in particular. One was King Frederick IV of Denmark, a very historic, the King of Denmark and Norway, which was perhaps Sweden's biggest rival in terms of Scandinavia wise. That was Sweden's only other big rival on the Scandinavian region of Europe. And of course, Denmark is more than willing to partake in a war against Sweden. They don't want to do it alone. He also pursues help from the king of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, that of King Augustus. And King Augustus is also more than willing to kind of go on it because he also wants to kind of renege on Swedish power in his region of Europe. Mostly, he's also desiring some land in the same Baltic region that Russia itself is desiring. Now, Pakul would actually be the one that would suggest inviting Russia to come into the war. He was actually the one that kind of come up with the idea of, should we invite Russia? In 1698, Poland and Denmark would end up signing an offensive treaty against Sweden, but they're still debating, do we invite Russia to join us? Now, Russia at this time is kind of a little iffy because Pakul recognizes Russia has a very large military, a large military that could come into use against fighting Sweden. However, they also recognize that there could be a conflict of interest because Russia is well known, also is vying for control of those Baltic Sea provinces, the same ones that are also desired by the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so there is some question from the King of Denmark and the King of Poland, Lithuania, over whether or not they should invite Peter and Russia come and join them in this crusade against Sweden. Eventually, they decide to offer him an alliance. They decide Russia is needed for this campaign and should have some role in it. Now, in negotiations with Peter, in order to get him involved, Peter would actually secretly commit toward joining a war against Sweden no later than April of 1700. However, he stipulated to Denmark and Poland both that I will not join a war with Sweden until I've concluded peace with my southern enemy to the south and our historic enemy, the Ottoman Empire, which anyone that knows Russian history well knows that the Ottoman Empire and Russia were enemies for literally centuries up until World War One, when both empires ended up collapsing. Most people know that if you know any Russian history. So that is Peter's only condition is I must conclude peace to myself first before I join any kind of war against Sweden because I don't need a two-front war. I need a one-front war, and the Ottomans are unlikely to want to be aiding Sweden in any form or way. They're unlikely to really do a war with them. So if I can conclude that war and then join you, all the better. However, the Poland and Denmark aren't so willing to really go with that. They're kind of questioning, like, we want to go at him now. We don't want to wait. And Russia's telling them. Peter is blatantly telling them, I'm not moving before I have secured peace to my south. He also wanted time, of course, to train up his own army and to get them professionally trained, to get them equipped. And he eventually would end up training an army of about 30,000 men to go towards in this war against Sweden. Peter would end up being somewhat disappointed because his two allies, Frederick and Augustus, would end up beginning the war early. Denmark would actually fire the first shots, and it went south for Denmark relatively quickly. Their capital of Copenhagen ended up getting surrounded by the Swedish fleet and by the Swedish armies, forcing Denmark to kind of surrender, then leaving Poland, Lithuania kind of by itself against Sweden, while Russia is still concluding peace with his neighbor to the south. And of course, Peter wasn't all that happy because he had told these two, do not make a move before I can join you. And here they did it anyway. So eventually, Peter ends up getting the peace concluded with the Ottoman Empire that he wants. And in August of 1700, just a little later than he had promised, he ends up officially declaring war on Sweden. Now, before he ended up declaring war on Sweden, Charles, who's already fighting with Poland, Lithuania, and Denmark, had kind of saw that Russia might also want to get in on this, and he feared Russia getting in on it because he's already fighting two countries. They don't need a third one added to the mix. And he had actually asked Peter for like assurances of, are you going to get involved with this? Like, are we still on good terms here. And Peter kind of flat out lied to him and had told him multiple times, like, oh, yeah, yeah, I'm not involved with them. They're going to do their own thing. I can assure you, Russia has no intention of going to war with you. Unfortunately, that little deception with Russia it does seem like they have a habit of doing that, doesn't it? They pretty much have said that same thing through multiple times in history, and look how well that turned out. Look at the war that's going on right now. How many times did they assure Ukraine, yeah, we're not going to invade you. We're doing it for our security. Yeah, that don't work out real well when it comes to dealing with Russia. So in August of 1700, Russia ends up officially joining this conflict against Sweden. So the first battle of or at least that the Russians are involved in with the Great Northern War is the siege of Narva. And Narva was a well-armed fortress city on the river Narova. Narva is in it kind of the key to or taking a certain province, the area of Swedish Ingria. And Swedish Ingria is the primary first target that the Russians have. So I'm actually going to circle it here for you because it is marked on this map. This is Narva. This is the fortress town that is the Russians' first target when this war breaks out. This is the key, the linchpin holding two Swedish provinces together, Swedish Estonia and Swedish Ingria. And Peter wants to take Ingria first. This is what he wants first. So he decides, I need to take Narva, which is the main fortress in this region, in order to kind of further my invasion further. So the city of Narva is a very well defended fortress, as I had stated. Poland and Denmark had actually tried to convince Peter to avoid attacking Narva, as they actually feared Russia gaining control of it, knowing that if Russia gained control of this large fortress-like city, that they would be in a very well defensible position, and if any conflict should come up between the allies after the war was concluded with Sweden, Russia would be in an advantageous position to hold the region that it had just conquered, which is still, mind you, they also have their own desires in the Baltic region just as much as Russia does. Peter had decided to attack it anyway in order to give him sea access to the Baltic Sea. The Russians would arrive in September, so only 1 month after declaring war on Sweden, only to face setbacks almost immediately. The Russians' cannons were not adequate, and they didn't have enough men for a siege. Peter had kind of rushed this assault. He had rushed it as soon as he declared war. He decided on moving on Narva, but he hadn't really considered that, given the defenses of this fortress, he had not really equipped his army to really go undergo a siege of the length that was going to be required to take it. So Peter ended up deciding that I am going to go to Riga and try to recruit more forces for us to get us more people. I'm going to leave my local commanders in charge and to continue the siege of the fortress, but I am going to go off myself and try to get more people to come and help us. So he decided that, you know, I'm going to go out and find more reinforcements for us. I'm going to abandon Narva. I'm going to leave my troops there besieging it, but I'm going to, as winter's coming in, I'm going to go out and gather supplies for our forces. Poland kind of leaves the door wide open because they end up leaving and evacuating nearby Riga, which leaves the Russians kind of in a precarious situation because now the Swedish have a large army not that far south of Narva. And Riga, mind you, here's Narva, here's Riga. Not that far of a marching distance. So what ends up happening is Peter leaves. He leaves to go find more support, more forces for his men, and more supplies and other stuff that they're going to need for the siege. Swedish King Charles XII ends up taking Peter's absence as a chance to throw the Russian attack off of Narva and to get them to force back. So he takes his 8,000 strong army and ends up which is actually smaller. It's 3 times smaller than the Russian force that is besieging the city, but they are better trained and better equipped. And this 8,000 strong Swedish army ends up trouncing the Russians in a battle on November 20th of 1700 during a snowstorm that forces the Russians to abandon their siege of Narva. Peter would order all surviving troops to retreat to Novgorod, to the city of Novgorod, which is in Russian control. He also feared that the defeat of Narva would lead to a Swedish invasion of the Russian capital of Moscow. So he also decided to strengthen Moscow's defenses and kind of also, take the winner to bide my time. I just lost a major setback. And the setback at Narva at the very beginning of the war in this November of 1700 battle would plague and haunt Peter for the next 4 years. He long desired to avenge the Russian loss of at the siege of Narva, and he still wanted that fortress all with all get out. But he recognized the time is not right. I have rushed this. I will have a second chance as the city, but for right now, we need to take the winner, rebuild our supplies, rebuild our army, and we need to strengthen our defenses for a long war, not a quick one. So ironically, even though Sweden's ultimately going to lose this war, first major battle with the Russians in the Great Northern War that they have with them is a loss for Russia. It is a win for Sweden. During that winter of 1700 to 1701, Peter is also introducing new taxes in order to finance new weapons and to finance his armies in order to maintain a good war effort. In 1701, Peter would end up meeting with the Polish king Augustus for negotiations. They would end up agreeing both agreeing to continue the war because at this point Denmark's been knocked out. It's just Poland, Lithuania, and Russia at this point. And they agreed on dividing the sphere of operations a little bit. Poland would focus on Swedish forces combating Sweden in Livonia and Estonia. Russia, on the other hand, would focus on Karelia and Ingria. Peter would also appoint a nobleman, Boris Sheremetev, as commander-in-chief of the Russian army, where before this, Peter was not against taking personal command of his military forces. Now he was going to have a military commander-in-chief to kind of assume command of the army while he was not there. So Poland and him kind of come to the agreement of we're going to split the area of operations, and I'm going to kind of outline a little bit here as well. So if we go up here, they are going to split the area of operations. So Poland and Lithuania are going to focus on this right here. They're going to focus on Livonia and Estonia, while Russia is in charge of taking Ingria and Karelia, which is this little portion up here in what is now Finland. They're going to be focused on those two regions in particular, going into the new year 1701. So Charles XII ended up deciding he wanted to first focus on defeating Augustus. He had trounced the Russians in November of 1700. He knew that Peter was kind of biding this time rebuilding his forces, so he didn't see Russia as the immediate threat yet. He saw Poland as being the immediate threat. Plus, Augustus had been somewhat of a Swedish vassal for a time, and he kind of viewed Augustus as a flat-out traitor. So he'd rather go against Augustus first rather than trying to focus on both Poland and Russia at the same time. Russia, during that time, actually won a battle against Sweden's navy in the Battle of Archangel, which would end up gaining them some naval access toward Karelia. In January of 1702, Russia would end up winning their first great victory at Erestfur in Livonia, which is kind of odd considering the factor that Poland was supposed to go after Livonia, but Russian forces there end up actually winning this battle. 3,000 Swedish soldiers would end up getting killed in the Battle of Erestfur in January 1702, and then by July, Russian troops had almost wiped out Swedish forces at Hummelshof in Livonia and were then able to occupy the entire province by July of 1702. So it's kind of odd because right off the bat, as we mentioned, there's conflict of interest. Although they had agreed at this earlier, conference between these two monarchs that we were going to go after two different regions, Russia is already going after Livonia and kind of seizing everything that was already something that Poland had said they were going to handle. By the end of 1702, a Russian victory on Lake Ladoga would also allow Russia to take Narva. And that was the second attack that he would end up getting in on Narva, which he was able to finally seize it. Well, not they wouldn't be able to take Narva, but they would actually be able to get around Narva. Like basically, Narva is cut off. So he's got Livonia now. he's moved into even kind of so what Peter has done, he's taken the majority of Livonia here, with a few holdouts, such as the fortress of Dorpat. He has not fully taken that yet. And he's able to move up even into Estonia, and now he's kind of got Narva surrounded. He hasn't moved on Narva yet, but it's coming. So that brings us to Notburg. And Notborg was a fortress on the Baltic that originally was built by Novgorod residents in the 1400s. Sweden had captured Notborg in 1611, and it ended up being a key area that Peter had to really go after because this is the epicenter of several multiple trade routes in the Baltic region and in Russia itself. So if he can take Notburg, it's going to be a really big win for the Russian forces. Peter was absolutely determined to retake this and make it Russian territory once again. So in October of 1702, Russian mortars would end up bombarding Notborg for 10 days until it would surrender. Upon taking the city, the Russians ended up renaming it Schlüsselburg. And before we go much further here, I guess we'll show off these two. So here is a depiction of the Battle of Narva, the siege of Narva that ended up being a Swedish victory over the Russians that opened the war up in 1700. So this is a depiction of that failed first battle that Peter had tried to take Narva the first time around and ended up getting trounced because he had left and his troops were under equipped for the siege. He ended up getting forced out by the Swedes. And then here we have a depiction of the bombardment of Notborg Fortress in 1702, which Notborg was kind of on an island, and thus the mortars were needed to kind of pound it into submission. As long as they could surround Notborg, they could take it. And just in case you want to know where Notborg is, I'm going to circle it here. This is where Notborg is. That is Notborg. Now, the Russian capture of Notborg in 1702 would actually open the way for Peter to seize the rest of the Swedish territories along the Baltic coast. In 1703, he would send 20,000 soldiers in a march toward the sea. They would ambush a small Swedish naval fleet from the marshes of the Neva River. And this would kind of catch the only really sizable Swedish defenses in the region off guard, and the Swedish naval fleet ended up having to retreat and flee the region. So now Sweden's Swedish provinces are pretty much cut off, and they're pretty much almost at the mercy of the Russian forces that are invading, with again a few small holdouts like Dorpat and that of Narva. Now, the Russians ended up managing to claim Ingria and the land along the Neva River, which was Peter's primary goal from the outset. And he decided that on the Neva River, where the Neva River connects from Lake Ladoga into the Baltic Sea, he was going to end up creating a new capital city for Russia, and of which he would name St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg, Russia is perhaps, I believe, I'm going to double check here real quick. I can't remember if it's the largest city in Russia or the second largest. But up until pretty much from Peter's reign until the end of World War One, it was actually the capital of Russia. It was the imperial capital. It is the second largest city in Russia after Moscow. Of course, now the capital's gone back to Moscow, which it had been actually before St. Petersburg, but Peter founds the city of St. Petersburg on this newly conquered land in Ingria, and he ends up deciding that this is where I'm going to found, this is where St. Petersburg is going to be. And if I'm not wrong, I believe that St. Petersburg is founded probably about right here, I think, because there's a river. This is Lake Ladoga. Yes, this is Lake Ladoga. And there's a river that connects the two, and that is the Neva River. So the Neva River is almost like I think where Notebook kind of is. So about right here, this would be, I believe, where St. Petersburg is. And that is where he found this new imperial capital for Russia, is on the banks of the Neva River. Now, Peter would call this his window on Europe because it's connected to the Baltic Sea. He can kind of, have these trade routes open to this new imperial capital. He can drastically try to westernize the city as much as possible, which he did. And this is kind of, his peephole onto the European countries of the western half of the continent. And the Swedish armies would try to attack St. Petersburg multiple times after its foundation in 1703, but all these attempts to attack it ended up in failure, and they were unable to seize the city. By the end of the year, a Russian victory on Lake Ladoga had actually allowed Russia to move further in on Narva and thus get ready to wipe out the Swedish forces that were in the region of Estonia and Livonia once and for all. So basically, they have control at this point, but those last little holdouts need to be taken care of. And that brings us to Dorpat and Narva the following year. So in 1704, the fortress town of Dorpat is in what is now Estonia, and it becomes the next target that Peter goes after. It would end up strengthening Russian control on the Baltic. It would annihilate one of the last Swedish holdouts in the region. Now, the Swedes had ended up reinforcing Dorpat, but this initially had caused Shermativ to kind of go around it. He decided that, okay, it's reinforced, let's go around it first. We can come back to it because they're kind of cut off. It's not like they're going to be getting much more. They would end up starting a 10-day siege on July 3rd of 1704 on Dorpat before the city would end up falling to the Russians on July 13th. Peter would immediately, upon taking Dorpat, turn his attention toward avenging his loss of 4 years before at Narva and finally taking that massive fortress. So on July 30th, not even probably 2 weeks after the end of the siege of Dorpat, the Russians end up beginning a bombardment of Narva for a second time. The city ends up actually falling to the Russians on August 9th. The Russians end up storming into Narva, and many of the Russian troops end up kind of going on this massacre of the civilians inside, be it men, women, children. They actually start going on this pillaging and massacre in, slaughter raid. That it gets so bad that Peter himself is appalled at what his troops are doing in Narva, and he ends up rushing into the city on horseback, actually calling for a ceasefire and gives orders that any of his soldiers who ignore his orders for a ceasefire will be killed on the spot, just to get his troops to stop their destruction of the city. And this is a depiction of that scene in August of 1704, where Peter is coming on his horse after the Russians have stormed into Narva finally after 4 years, and he's kind of trying to get his troops to stop what you're doing. This is getting out of hand. With the victory at Narva, Russia has pretty much almost complete control over Swedish Livonia, Swedish Estonia, and Swedish Ingria. They don't quite have Karelia yet. They have a good portion of it, but not all of it. So that brings us to what is perhaps going to end up. Now, there were other conflicts in the next 5 years. There were intermittent conflicts as Sweden tried to take back these forces. But again, Sweden is primarily focused on Poland. Between the years of 1702 and 1706, King Charles of Sweden had primarily put his attention on Poland. He's not all that focused on Russia. He viewed again that the Polish King Augustus was absolutely a traitor, and he wants him deposed. So he doesn't even want him on the throne. In his place, he would appoint a pro-Swedish ruler to rule the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. In 1701, as we had mentioned, Sweden had managed to capture Riga, and the following year, in 1702, they took the Polish capital of Warsaw. Now, unfortunately for Charles, he did not capture Augustus in Warsaw, so he ended up having to give chase, and this caused him to go, back and forth with Augustus for a couple more years because he couldn't get that decisive victory to force Augustus from his throne. Finally, in 1706, Charles was forced to invade Saxony in order to pursue Augustus. Augustus himself had actually been from Saxony originally. He had retreated to his home kingdom, and this forced Charles to kind of, I don't have a choice. I'm going after this man, so I'm going to have to invade them too. So that brings Saxony into the war. And Augustus ends up kind of getting trapped because there is no Russian help as they had withdrawn from Poland entirely. They're too focused on matters up north, and Augustus ends up being trapped by Charles and is then finally forced to step down from the Polish Lithuanian throne. However, the attack and time that Charles had spent going after Augustus in Saxony and Poland ended up costing him time against the Russians, who now have time to kind of rebuild and recover militarily. It was like 2 or 3 years since the seizure of Narva and Dorpat. So now, at least in Charles's view, I have now defeated the traitor Augustus, and I can turn my full attention toward Russia and Peter. And that is what he ends up wanting to do. Now, Peter correctly kind of sees, this might be the chance to offer peace, Charles, that we have pretty much gotten what we want, and I'm willing to draw the line here. So Peter in 1707 actually offers Sweden a peace deal where he would return almost all the lands that he had actually occupied on the condition that he retained St. Petersburg and the Neva River as a border and the Neva River as a borderline for the Tsardom of Russia. Charles, because of Peter's insistence on maintaining that sea access and on keeping a city that he had founded on what Charles viewed was Swedish territory, refused and initiated instead an invasion up from Saxony into Russia. Charles's main goal was to march on the Russian capital of Moscow, but it ended up suffering several setbacks. The winter of 1708 to 1709, 1708 was when this invasion force finally got underway, was one of the worst in modern European history, and it was brutally cold, which rapidly, of course, if anyone that has any idea of military campaigns against Russia, the Russian winter is unbelievably harsh and has spelled doom for more too of some of the conquerors who thought they were going to go into Russia and invade it, be it from Napoleon in 1812 to the Nazis in the 1940s. It has never ended well. And Charles ends up kind of making the same mistake. He goes in, his troops are not prepared for the savage Russian winter, and this ends up kind of causing them to take quite a few, it weakens their army quite a bit over that winter with how harsh it is. Now, Peter would also authorize scorched earth tactics to deny resources to the invading Swedish so that they couldn't live off the land as they came. So, farm fields are burnt. They're also tearing up they're also blocking roads, they're burning bridges, they're doing everything they can to impede the invasion of these Swedish forces. Charles would end up taking his troops after as the winter came to a close, and he marched into what is now Ukraine. He would end up hearing rumors of about a contingent of about 5,000 Russian troops at the village of Poltava, with abundant supplies in tow. Now, mind you, Charles isn't really going for Poltava for the troops. He's going there because of the rumor that they are overwhelmingly loaded with supplies, which his army is in desperate need of. And that is what he's going to go to Poltava for. He thinks, oh, it's only 5,000 troops. That's not going to be hard to seize. And we kind of do need the supplies, so let's go to Poltava. Charles ends up actually ignoring the advice of his generals. His generals kind of sense that something's not right. Why would they have all these supplies here at Poltava and not have a large contingent of troops guarding them? And they're kind of advising Charles, you need to be a little careful because this could be a trap. This could be some sort of a trick from the Russians. And Charles actually ignores their advice and he lays siege in May of 1709. The Russians ended up massing on the other side of Poltava, waiting for Peter, who would end up taking personal command in this battle. Peter would order his troops to cross the Vorskla River into Poltava, and then once he learned at least that the Swedish were low on gunpowder and wouldn't be able to keep up the siege for much longer, he ordered his Russian troops to cross into Poltava from across the Vorskla River. The Swedish would end up attacking the Russian forces outright on June 27th of 1709, but ended up being thwarted and thrown backwards, and then the two armies would meet on open field. During the course of the Battle of Poltava, Peter ended up leading his troops personally. He ended up going in on a horseback and actually fought with his troops, which inspired quite a few many of them. Charles, on the other hand, ended up actually getting shot and wounded during this battle and had to be carried out on a stretcher. After a few hours, the Russians ended up winning at Poltava, and the Swedish Continental Army or Invasion Force that had been formed ended up was basically shattered. It was pretty much broken. Many of them ended up getting taken prisoner by the Russians, while a small fragment of them ended up fleeing with Charles to the Ottoman Empire in order to escape capture by the Russians. But the Russians pretty much just annihilated Sweden's continental army that had been this main invasion force, and that is going to be a main big hindrance for Sweden going forward. Now, mind you, the war doesn't officially end until 1721, and there's still a lot of conflict that happens otherwise. But in terms of the biggest battles of the war, Poltava is the turning point, according to most historians. It is the point where Russia kind of cracks Sweden to the point that it's not going to recover. Sweden's defeat at Poltava was something it never fully recovered from, and this marks the beginning of Russia's ascension over Sweden during the rest of the war. With the victory at Poltava, Denmark and Poland ended up rejoining the war, and due to Russian negotiations, Peter is able to get King Augustus restored to the Polish throne, and Saxony even joins in this time against Sweden. Peter also ends up building up a Russian navy, and he ends up desiring to go after the Finnish coast now that the Swedes are definitely on the back pedal. So in 1710, the Russians ended up taking Riga back from the Swedish, who had ended up taking it from the Poles. So Russia ends up getting Riga in 1710, and along with the town of Tallinn, which is now the capital of Estonia. The Swedish Continental Army, or what was left of it, I should say, ends up withdrawing to Swedish Pomerania, those that were still on the continent and hadn't gone with Charles of the Ottoman Empire. Now, Peter was angered that the Ottomans would even harbor Charles, and he demanded that the Ottomans hand over Charles to him. Now, Charles had fled to what is now Moldova, near the Romania and Ukraine, and at the time that was still Ottoman land. And the Ottomans were not really keen about handing Charles over to the Russians. And of course, that might have also had something to do that they were historical rivals to the Russians and could kind of see that it was going to irritate Peter. They really didn't care if he got kicked or whatever. But they decide, yeah, we don't care. We're not releasing him. So Peter kind of decides, okay, I'm going to invade you guys and force you to hand me him over, which goes badly for Peter and forces him to back off to the point that the Ottomans realize, okay, we don't really want another war with you. I know we just whooped your butt, but we don't want another war. So here's the deal. You're going to back out of our country right now before we do declare a war on you. And at the same time, you're going to guarantee safe passage for King Charles here to go back up to Sweden without you end up getting him. To be fair, Peter very begrudgingly agrees to that term, and Charles at first kind of realizes it could be a trap. He's like, "I don't want to go. I want to stay here." And Ottoman says, "Nope, you're out. I don't want to deal with you. You guys can fight all you want. I'm out." The Ottoman Empire was no part of this. So they kind of kicked Charles out when he initially refuses to go back home to Sweden because they kind of view that, this is going to get the Ottoman Empire involved in another war that we really don't want to be involved with right now. Now, Russia, after Charles is sent home, they end up focusing on capturing Finland. The Russians want to try to take Finland from the Swedish, and between the years of 1710 and 1714, they end up capturing many of the Finnish ports along the coast, such as Viborg, Helsinki, and Porvoo. And many of these ports would kind of gain Russia coastal dominance of the Finnish coast. Now, this would also start the Russian occupation of Finland, because mind you, Russia will not officially get Finland until, the Napoleonic Wars. But this is going to start a brief occupation of Finland by Russian forces that will last from 1714 until the end of the war in 1721. And it was absolutely brutal to the native Finnish population. And even to this day, the Finnish population, I believe they have a specific term that they call that period in time because of how brutal the Russian occupation was toward them. Even though they weren't Swedish themselves, they were treated almost as if they were. Before we go much further here, do have one last big image for you guys, and this would be the Battle of Poltava. This was the big Russian victory in 1709 that kind of marked the turning point of the Great Northern War, of which the Swedish Continental Army ended up getting absolutely shattered, Charles was wounded, and Russia is now in the ascendancy in this war along with its allies. Now, Charles would officially get back to Sweden. He would return to the Swedish-held German city of Stralsund in September of 1714. He finally got back to Swedish territory. However, right as he gets back, there's a new country entering the fray. An alliance between Peter and George I of Great Britain has just been signed, which means Britain is now entering the war. Now, part of this had been that George I had been the Elector of Hanover. He had actually come from a German state. In 1714, he had been invited to come in and take the English throne, and he has a stake in this. His native Hanover is right on the battlefront. And at the same time, because of this, Charles had actually been directing Sweden to support the Jacobite rebellion up in Scotland that was supporting the old Stuart dynasty against George's rule. So Great Britain has a little bit of a reason to get involved here. They're getting their king at least does. And Great Britain's now involved, but the bigger threat comes that in the year following in in December of 1715, Prussia ends up entering the war, which is another Germanic state, and now Sweden is getting overly overwhelmed by enemies on its doorstep. So Charles ends up fleeing Stralsund, going to mainland Sweden, and Stralsund ends up falling to the Prussians in December. The fall of Weimar in 1716 would mean that that Sweden had lost nearly pretty much all of its German and Baltic territories by 1716. Charles would, instead of trying to focus on retaking these lost territories, of which is now surrounded by all of his enemies, decided to try to invade Norway, which was a Danish territory at the time, and tried to attack Denmark through that way. Unfortunately, Charles ended up getting shot dead on November 30th of 1718 while besieging the city of Frederiksted. He was succeeded by his younger sister, Ulrika. So the death of Charles ends up leading to the final phase of the war. Now, you would think that with Charles dead, Sweden might be, and being that Sweden had just lost its Baltic and Germanic provinces, that it would be more than willing to concede to this coalition, to this anti-Swedish coalition, and actually come to the table. Unfortunately, it was not. They still wanted to fight, and because of that, it was going to cause further conflict. This would force the coalition to attack Sweden itself in many ways. A large Russian fleet was sent in the summer of 1719 and then split into three parts. One group would go to Uppland, another to Stockholm and Södermanland as well. So, Uppland, Stockholm, and Södermanland are going to be the three targets that are going to be targeted by this split up Russian fleet that would carry over 30,000 men total. They would raid up and down the Swedish coast. Now, the Swedish were able to actually save the capital of Stockholm. They were able to keep the Russians away from their capital, but many of the surrounding islands in the archipelago surrounding the capital ended up getting burned and destroyed by the Russians. And the raids would continue along the Swedish coast until Sweden kind of finally waved the white flag and agreed to peace in 1721. Now, during the peace negotiations in 1721, the anti-Swedish coalition would end up splitting into during the peace negotiations. Britain, Denmark, and Prussia, who had sought land in northern Germany, were also looking for a restriction of Russian expansion. They wanted land, yes, but at the same time, they were not all that keen about Russia actually getting more powerful. And they ended up signing a separate treaty with Sweden called the Treaty of Fredericksburg in June of 1720, and thus by 1720, peace has been concluded between Sweden, Denmark, Great Britain, and Prussia. Now, Sweden had hoped to receive support from these other Western European powers in its negotiations with Russia and trying to force Russia to kind of cede back some of their seized Baltic territories. However, internal conflicts erupting at home in Great Britain and in France, who had been the other one that Sweden was kind of hoping might come to their aid, kind of forced them to go into negotiations with the Russians by themselves, which kind of put them at a disadvantage being on the losing side of the conflict. So, in the Treaty of Nystad, which was signed between Sweden and Russia in August of 1721, Sweden would retain control of Finland. Russia would have to hand Finland back over to Sweden. So, Finland here, It's going to remain in Swedish hands for now, at least for another 100 years. However, Russia will get to keep its conquests in Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, Kexholm, and Karelia. So pretty much, I'm going to draw the new border. I believe they got all this as well. This would be Kexholm. So the new border here is going to be here. Sweden still is going to retain Finland, but all this is where Kexholm is. They get to retain this. Karelia would be up here. They get to keep this, and all this is now Russian territory. Baltic coast established just like Peter had wanted. And by November, Peter then, with this expanded and more powerful Russia that is emerging and taking the place after the Treaty of Nystad, Russia is now a dominant player in European politics. It's entered the European stage and it's now a major power player in Eastern Europe, and which is going to mean that the other European powers are going to have to be on the lookout for this growing empire in the East. The war also, in a way, kind of weakens the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, which becomes kind of a vassal state of Russia at this point, and will lead by 1795, it will end up getting partitioned between Prussia, Russia, and Austria. But the end of the war in 1721, in November, with Russia kind of seizing the spot on the European spotlight, Peter takes that time to officially issue a proclamation of a Russian empire. He now enters, it's no longer the Tsardom of Russia. We are now the Russian Empire. We are an imperial regime, and I am now the emperor of Russia, not just the Tsar. But that with the end of the Great Northern War in 1721, with the defeat of Sweden, Sweden would end up kind of going into the stage of, more parliamentary government where they would kind of go down from their colonial days and from their old imperial days. But Russia is now rapidly ascending on the European stage as a result of this war. They gained a major foothold in the Baltic region, some of the most viable trade coastline that they could possibly have gotten. Plus, they've mastered their prestige because they've managed to trounce one of the most powerful nations in Europe at that time. They trounced Sweden in many of the battles that came against them, and thus they're a military power to be trifled with. So by the end of 1721, Russia is now growing. It's now a Russian empire, and it's now that major player that is going to make nations like, Spain and France and Great Britain kind of know, okay, we're going to have to watch this new neighbor because they're not just on the fringe anymore. So that will conclude for this video. So if anyone has any further, stuff you want to go into with the Great Northern War or elaborate on or any further details of that, feel free to put it in the comments section and I'll be more than happy to go through them and look through them when I can. As for next week, we're going to take a look at, I'm just going to go ahead and say what it is now. We're going to take a look at Russian colonization of Alaska, which I felt might be a little fitting since January is a cold, snowy month, especially right here in Ohio right now. We've had nothing but snow for the past week, and I think we're getting more tomorrow. But we're going to take a look at Russian colonization in Alaska, which was kind of their North American colonization effort, and how that comes about, and why the Russians ultimately ended up selling it to the United States. So we'll take a look at that next week. So any questions, any comments, any expanded stuff, put it in the comment section. If not, I'll be more than sure to go through them when I can, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video. So hopefully everyone has a good week, and we'll see you all then.